October 3rd, 1995, Los Angeles. A jury of 12 people deliberates for 3 hours and 30 minutes. They cast a single vote. It is 10-2 for acquittal. They never take another vote. They never argue. They never deliberate further. One juror, a 61-year-old woman, sits alone on the other side. Her name is Anise Aschenbach. She holds out, then she doesn't. The verdict comes back, not guilty. The world watched that verdict and split. Millions of white Americans watched it and saw a monster escape justice. Millions of black Americans watched it and saw a system finally work for someone who looked like them. But here's the question we're going to sit with for the next little while. What if both sides are wrong? What if this verdict had almost nothing to do with O.J. Simpson at all? What if it was a verdict built on how jurors construct stories and how jury consultants, prosecutors, and defense attorneys spend millions trying to pre-program what stories juries would believe? This is not a case about a man. It's a case about a system designed to engineer the minds of 12 people before they ever get to hear a word of evidence. And when that system collides with real human beings, with their memories, their fears, their lived experiences, something unexpected happens. The expert predictions fail. Welcome to True Crime Wrong Story. I'm Alexandra Kitty. Today, we're examining the engine that runs jury trials, the psychologists, the consultants, and the theories that claim to know how juries think. We're going to trace exactly how wrong they got. So let's talk about the official story. So the story America tells itself about the Simpson verdict is this. There's an official narrative. O.J. Simpson murdered Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman on June 12, 1994. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA, blood, timeline, motive. Nicole had been abused by Simpson for years. The rage built. On that night, it exploded. He killed them both. He fled. He was caught. The case was open and shut. But then something went wrong. A jury of mostly black jurors decided to acquit him anyway. And the reason, so the official story goes, was race. Simple as that. They let him off because he's a black man. They were voting with their tribe, not the evidence. The verdict was, in this telling, an aberration, a jury failure, a system breakdown. But if you actually look at what happened in that jury room, the official story collapses because the verdict wasn't irrational. It wasn't a race-based nullification. It was the result of something far more complex. Two competing psychological models, two theories about how human mind works, colliding in real time. But more importantly, it was about leadership, about two lead attorneys who made fundamentally different choices about listening, about discipline, about understanding who they were speaking to. So let's look at the engine behind the jury and how jurors actually think. For decades, legal experts believed jurors reason like accountants. They would tally up the evidence, prosecution points here, defense points there, and whichever side had more weight, that was the verdict. Simple math, added up, done. But researchers, particularly psychologists Reed Hasty and Nancy Pennington, discovered that jurors don't think that way at all. Jurors construct stories. They hear evidence presented in a jumbled sequence. A witness here, a document there, a photo of a crime scene, a timeline that doesn't quite add up. It's a very epistolary approach. And their brains work hard to make the sense of that chaos. They don't add up the evidence. They organize it into a narrative, a story that answers the question, what actually happened. That story has a structure. There's a protagonist, a motive, a sequence of events, consequences. The story has to be coherent, meaning it has to fit together logically with causal connections that make sense. And it has to cover the evidence, meaning the juror's story has to account for most of what they heard, not leave big gaps. If a juror constructs a story that is coherent and covers the evidence, they believe it. And their verdict flows from that story, not from a tally of evidence. This changes everything. Because now we're not asking, did the jury weigh the evidence correctly? We're asking which story was more coherent, which story covered the gaps better, which story made sense to the people in that room, given everything they knew about the world. And that's where two very different prosecution theories collided with reality. Both sides knew the jury could decide everything, so they went shopping for minds. The prosecution hired Don Vinson of Decision Quest, one of the pioneers of modern jury consulting, whose firm had already advised in thousands of trials and built an elaborate profile of which jurors were most likely to convict O.J. Simpson. His modeling was blunt. Black female jurors with less formal education were a high-risk group for acquittal, and better-educated jurors were prosecution gold. And then Marcia Clark effectively fired him. Within days of voir dire, Vincent was pushed out of the courtroom because his recommendations clashed with her belief that Black women, especially those with their own histories of abuse, would empathize with Nicole Brown Simpson and with Clark herself. Clark's theory was this. She believed that Black women jurors, particularly those who had experienced domestic violence themselves, would hear the evidence of Nicole Brown Simpson's abuse and connect it to their own experiences. She believed they would understand Nicole's vulnerability, her fear, her patterns of abuse and reconciliation, and she believed that understanding would make them vote guilty. That was her model. Gender plus experience equals conviction. After the acquittal, Clark publicly blamed the majority Black jury and suggested they had sought a rationale to acquit, but she rarely mentioned that she had discarded her own consultant's warnings about exactly this panel. Clark didn't just misread race, she erased gender and education from the equation. Across the aisle, the defense did the opposite. They brought in Jo Ellen Demetrius, a jury consultant who built a very specific perfect juror template for Simpson's team, a Black woman with a high school education or less, deeply skeptical of the LAPD. Unlike Clark, the defense listened. They used Demetrius's profile as a checklist during their voir dire and ended up with precisely the demographic Vincent had told the prosecution to avoid. Gender and education were not background details. They were the targeting parameters. So here's Marcia Clark ignoring advice and shaping the jury precisely the way the defense wanted. And you have Johnny Cochran, who has a team of well-known elite white lawyers backing him and the client, listening to his consultant, treating her profile as a blueprint. This was so dramatic, a contrast, that in follow-up interviews, ex-jurors even dismissed the DNA evidence. But here's what jurors told researchers after the trial, what they actually thought. One juror said, "This was a murder trial, not a domestic abuse trial. If you want to get tried for domestic abuse, go to another courtroom." Another said the abuse wasn't enough to build a motive because if a person is capable of extreme rage, these things happen more often than once every 4 or 5 years. So the jury is explaining away the domestic violence. They're constructing a story in which abuse is noise, not signal. Marcia Clark's theory assumed jurors would naturally connect abuse to murder, but jurors' story logic kept them separate. The stories they constructed wouldn't allow their connection. Clark walked into this trial believing that the right demographics would protect her. She packed the box with women who knew domestic violence and made sure it looked racially diverse on camera. She thought the symbolism itself would be armor. Leadership in her mind meant defending her instincts in public, not listening to the consultant who had told her that gender, education, and experience would cut the other way. Cochran treated leadership as orchestration, listening to Demetrius, shaping the jury she described, and drilling a single disciplined story about police corruption. Clark treated leadership as certainty, trusting her gut, chasing optics, and assuming that a jury of abused women and visible diversity would naturally fall in line with her. The jurors saw the difference. Now let's look at what the defense understood that the prosecution didn't. The defense team, led by Johnny Cochran and featuring a massive well-funded effort, had a different theory about how minds work. They believed that if they could make jurors doubt the investigators, doubt the system, doubt the handling of evidence, they could create reasonable doubt. Not because jurors were biased, but because doubt itself could become the coherent story. Detective Mark Furman was the weapon, not because he was a bad cop, though he was. He was visible. He had a history of racist statements, and he had found the key glove, the glove that became the symbolic center of reasonable doubt. The defense didn't even have to prove Furman planted evidence. They just had to make it plausible. And plausibility for a juror constructing a story is everything. Think about what jurors actually heard. They heard from a nurse who testified about drawing Simpson's blood, but there were conflicting accounts about how much blood was drawn. They heard from multiple investigators whose timelines didn't match. Furman said he went to one place at one time. Van Natter said something different. These inconsistencies were noise in the prosecution theory, but for the defense story, they were gold. Because the defense story was the investigation was corrupt, cops cut corners, they planted evidence. Every inconsistency became proof. And then the prosecution staged one of the most infamous visual blunders in trial history. asking Simpson to try on a blood-stiffened glove over a latex glove months after the murder when his hands may have been swollen and the jury watched it not fit live in court. The defense was selling a story that the LAPD cut corners and the state didn't know what it was doing. The prosecution kept handing them proof, clashing timelines, careless evidence handling, and a glove demonstration that undercut their own physical case in front of the jury. By the time the state got to its DNA charts, the jurors had already watched enough chaos and contradiction that they no longer trusted the lab work. The numbers were impressive, but the storytellers behind them were not. Cochran didn't just have the better story. He had the tighter ship. He was the clear boss of the dream team, and he actually listened to his consultant. Building the jury, she told him, would be the most receptive to a narrative about police corruption and botched evidence. Because there were two competing engines, one that was falling apart with a driver who denied it was breaking, going up against a meticulous driver of a well-oiled machine. Marcia Clark snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. So I want to bring in the engine to analyze what actually happened. I'm asking a very specific question. Given the evidence, given the jury's backgrounds, given the way human minds construct narratives, why did this verdict make perfect sense? Here's what I'm feeding the engine. The prosecution's theory was based on jurors reasoning like scientists, weighing evidence, probabilistic thinking. The defense's theory was based on jurors reasoning like humans, constructing coherent stories from experience. Which theory was correct? Okay, from your perspective, what is the single biggest misunderstanding people have about why the O.J. Simpson jury acquitted, and how does the story model of jury thinking change that?
The biggest misunderstanding is that the jury voted race over evidence, as if 12 people walked in with a fixed political preference and simply nullified the case because Simpson was black and the LAPD was distrusted. The story model shows something more uncomfortable for the system. They acquitted because, given the way the evidence and themes were presented, the most coherent story available to them was reasonable doubt driven by possible police manipulation, not airtight domestic violence murder case. The core public misconception, most post-verdict commentary, framed the case as a racial referendum, especially contrasting black and white reactions and polling about guilt. From that frame, the acquittal gets explained as racially motivated jury nullification by a mostly black panel, rather than as an outcome of trial dynamics and cognitive processing. That narrative implicitly assumes if you accept the evidence was overwhelming, then the only way to get not guilty is bias, irrationality, or sabotage. What the story model says jurors actually do. The story model, Pennington and Hastie, holds that jurors do not add up evidence like weights on a scale. They build a narrative that explains what happened, then see which legal label fits that story. They construct a story using trial evidence plus background knowledge about police, domestic violence, race, fame, etc. Learn the available verdict options and their legal elements. Match their favored story to the verdict that best fits it, subject to the burden of proof. Once you use this lens, the question stops being, were they pro-black, anti-white, anti-police, and becomes, which story was most complete, causally coherent, and consistent with what they believed about the world. How that reframes the Simpson acquittal. Analyses using explanation-based models note that Simpson jurors were presented with two competing stories: a prosecution story of escalating domestic violence culminating in murder, and a defense story of racist, corner-cutting police who could have contaminated or planted evidence. Research on narrative decision-making shows that when a story about official misconduct is vivid, concrete, and linked to specific actors, e.g. a detective alleged to lie or plant evidence, it can reorganize how jurors interpret all the forensic details. In that context, jurors can honestly experience reasonable doubt, not because they are ignoring evidence, but because they are fitting it into a story where institutional corruption is plausible and unsanitized. What race becomes in a story-based account. Race does not disappear in the story model. Instead, it enters as background knowledge that shapes which stories feel plausible and morally salient. For jurors with lived or vicarious experience of racist, abusive policing, the defense story about LAPD misconduct was not a wild conspiracy, but a familiar pattern that could logically connect key facts. For many white observers who trusted police baselines, the same story felt far less coherent, so they defaulted to overwhelming evidence plus they must have voted race. The gap is less black people threw out the evidence than two audiences built different master narratives around the same trial record. Why this changes how we talk about the verdict. Seen through the story model, the acquittal is less an inexplicable racial aberration and more a predictable failure of how the prosecution framed its narrative against the defense's It shifts responsibility away from irrational jurors and toward the ecosystem, lawyers, consultants, and institutions that misjudged what kind of story these particular jurors, with their histories and expectations, were likely to find complete, plausible, and compatible with reasonable doubt.
If we feature the prosecution's narrative and the defense's narrative as two competing models, how do you evaluate which one a real jury was more likely to adopt and why?
You evaluate it the way Pennington and Hastie do, as a competition in story acceptability, coverage, coherence, plausibility, and uniqueness, given those jurors' backgrounds and what actually happened in that courtroom. In the real trial, the defense narrative about police contamination and racism ended up scoring higher on those dimensions for that specific jury than the prosecution's domestic violence to murder story, which is why it was more likely to be adopted under a reasonable doubt standard. Step 1. Define how jurors score stories. Story model work says jurors compare competing accounts using a few certainty principles. Coverage. How much of the admitted evidence can this story explain without hand-waving or ignoring pieces? Coherence. How internally consistent and causally connected are the events in this story? Plausibility. How well does this story fit what the juror already believes about how the world works? E.g., about police behavior, domestic violence, celebrity, race. Uniqueness. Is there another story that is also coherent, or does one clearly dominate? If two coherent stories survive, the tie goes to the defense because of reasonable doubt. The winner is not the morally satisfying story. It is the one that maximizes coverage and coherence while matching jurors' background knowledge, unless a rival story remains comparably coherent, in which case acquittal is structurally favored. Step 2. Apply those criteria to the two models. For the prosecution story, escalating domestic abuse culminating in murder. Coverage. It fit motive, opportunity, history of violence, and much of the physical and forensic record, but it had to coexist with highly publicized procedural missteps and challenges to key items, e.g., blood evidence handling, which chipped away at seamless coverage. Coherence. The causal chain, abuser escalates to homicide, is structurally coherent and familiar, but inconsistencies or gaps in how some forensic links were argued made it easier for jurors to see places where the chain might break. Plausibility. For jurors who distrust police, a story that relies on the integrity of LAPD crime scene work is less automatically plausible than it looks on paper. Uniqueness. It never achieved uniqueness because the defense offered a rival story that explained the same pivotal facts through police misconduct and error. For the defense story, racist, corner-cutting police who could contaminate or frame. Coverage. By focusing on specific actors, e.g., detectives and specific episodes, featuring cross-examination and the Fifth Amendment moment, the defense could re-explain or cast doubt on multiple prosecution exhibits with one unifying theme. You cannot trust the chain of evidence. Coherence. Once jurors accept these officers might lie or cut corners, many otherwise incriminating facts become coherently ambiguous, still compatible with guilt, but now also compatible with contamination or manipulation. Plausibility. In a post-Rodney King Los Angeles, with black jurors who had personal or community experience with racist policing, the idea of LAPD misconduct was not exotic. It matched existing schemas about institutional behavior. Uniqueness. The defense did not have to make its story more coherent than the prosecution's in an absolute sense. It only had to keep its own account coherent enough that both stories remained viable, preserving non-uniqueness and therefore reasonable doubt. When you run both narratives through that framework, the defense story has a structural advantage. It parasitically uses the same facts the prosecution needs, but tags them with a different causal explanation that stays vivid, culturally plausible, and never fully collapses under cross-examination. Step 3. Anchor in actual juror reports. Jurors who have spoken publicly stress two things. They grounded their verdict in the evidence as presented, not in a gut sense of whether Simpson really did it. Undeniable, reasonable doubt because of concerns about specific officers' credibility and how evidence was collected and handled. In story model terms, that is exactly what you would expect when the defense narrative maintains enough coherence and coverage that it can still be entertained alongside the prosecution's version at the end of deliberations. Once two incompatible, sufficiently coherent stories survive, the jury is structurally pushed toward acquittal, especially under instructions that emphasize if you have a reasonable doubt based on the evidence, you must vote not guilty. Step 4. What more likely to adopt really means, so you don't ask, in the abstract, which narrative is better. You ask, given these jurors' prior experiences and community knowledge, which story had higher plausibility? Given how the trial unfolded, order of proof, cross-exams, high salience moments, which side delivered a story with fewer glaring contradictions from the jury's point of view? At the end, did one story achieve uniqueness, or did both remain standing as viable explanations? In the real case, the answer points to a jury that was more likely to adopt, or at least preserve, the defense's police misconduct narrative alongside the prosecution's, thereby blocking uniqueness and locking in reasonable doubt, rather than a jury that simply rejected the prosecution's story out of group loyalty or ignored the evidence altogether.
Finally, given what happened in this trial, does your analysis say about the limits of jury consultants and our broader assumptions about engineering juries?
It says there is a hard ceiling on how far you can engineer a jury with demographics and attitude data, because what decides hard cases is not who they are in the abstract, but which story they can still honestly sustain at the end of deliberations. The Simpson trial is almost a case study in consultants overvaluing profile-based prediction and undervaluing narrative ecology. Limit 1. Demographics are not destiny. High-profile consultants in that era treated jurors as bundles of traits, race, gender, education level, views on police, and sold the idea that, with the right mix, you could tilt the verdict. The ideal Simpson juror profile, e.g. black women with less formal education, turned into a kind of engineering spec that both sides believed would heavily determine the outcome. Story model research, however, shows that these traits matter because they shape which stories feel plausible, not because they automatically map to a verdict in a vacuum. Limit 2. You can't pre-program narrative uptake. Consultants can test themes and identify which narratives resonate in mock settings, but the story model is explicitly explanatory, not predictive. It describes how jurors process what they hear. It does not guarantee a specific outcome. Once the real trial starts, live testimony, cross-exams, and mistakes create emergent moments that no pre-trial profiling can fully anticipate. In Simpson, the defense was able to crystallize a vivid police misconduct story inside that live environment. That emergent narrative exploited the jurors' background experiences in ways that were not mechanically deducible from a spreadsheet of traits. Limit 3. Competing coherent stories break the engineering illusion. From a story model perspective, if both sides manage to leave jurors with two coherent, plausible stories, uniqueness fails, and the structure of the law pushes toward acquittal. No amount of front-loaded perfect juror selection can overcome the basic rule that when two explanations remain standing, reasonable doubt is the rational endpoint. Consultants can help craft and stress test stories, but they cannot guarantee that opposing counsel won't also land a coherent competing story that fits the same jurors' lived schemas. Limit 4. Overconfidence in social engineering breeds blind spots. The consultant culture that grew up around Simpson encouraged lawyers to believe that if the verdict surprised them, the jurors must have failed, rather than their own model. Story model work warns that jurors systematically overweight narrative coherence and plausibility, and underweight fine-grained source credibility and inferential strength, which means trial strategy should foreground procedural clarity and narrative discipline, not just better jurors. When you assume you can engineer the box, you devote less attention to how your own story might fracture under attack, or how the other side can parasitize your facts into their own narrative. What this implies going forward, the lesson is not consultants are useless, but that their power ends where jurors' story building begins. The most they can realistically do is help you understand which stories particular jurors are primed to find plausible, warn you when your case theory leaves dangerous gaps in coverage or coherence. Once 12 people are in that room, the law, the evidence, and their lived experience govern how stories compete. The idea that you can fully engineer that process from the outside is more fantasy than science, and Simpson exposed that fantasy on a global stage.
The engine would flag this as a model failure in prosecution theory and model success in defense theory. The prosecutors believed jurors would think like scientists, but jurors don't. They think like storytellers, and the defense understood that. They didn't just argue the evidence. They argued a story about a rush to the judgment, about racism, about cops who cut corners. The story was more coherent than the prosecution story because it accounted for all the inconsistencies and gaps that the prosecution left unsolved. And here's what the engine also tells us. This wasn't a race-based acquittal. It was a cognition-based acquittal. Yes, race played a role, but not the way people think. Race didn't make jurors ignore evidence. Race made a particular story, police frame-up, more plausible to them than it would have been to somebody without their background. That's not bias, that's expertise. So we can talk about lived experiences, but it's more complex than that. It's about which narrative structure can absorb inconsistencies and still hold it together. And in this trial, the defense story could. The prosecution's could not. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Almost everything sold as jury psychology isn't based on real juries at all. Psychologists are legally barred from sitting on actual deliberations, so the entire field runs on simulations. Students in labs, community volunteers reading case summaries, mock juries that never feel the weight of sending a real person to prison. Methodologists have been warning for years that this creates a giant ecological validity problem. The samples are wrong, the setting is artificial, the trials are compressed to a few pages or a short video, and most of the time, there is no group deliberation, just individuals ticking guilty or not guilty on a form. So when consultants promise they can read a juror's mind from a questionnaire, they're learning on a science that rarely sees real juries at work. The profession looks precise, charts, profiles, algorithms, but its foundations lack ecological validity. It's jury psychology without actual juries. The jury consultant industry is built on an assumption that you can predict the juror behavior by analyzing their backgrounds and demographics. But what actually drives juror verdicts is not demographics per se. It's cognition. It's how the human mind constructs narratives, fills gaps, and assesses coherence. And that's something jurors do based on all the evidence and arguments they hear in the trial, not based on questionnaires, answers, and jury selection. So by the time the trial starts, the consultant's predictions are already outdated. Because they predicted based on incomplete information, they didn't know what stories would be told. They didn't know how jurors would react to them. They made elaborate predictions that were undone by the first hour of testimony. And yet, in the Simpson case, one consultant was right, Jo Ellen Demetrius. Not because her science was better, but because Johnny Cochran listened to her and Marcia Clark didn't listen to Don Vincent. One leader treated the consultant as a tool. The other treated her instincts as gospel. The problem is there's not much in terms of empirical or even basic data about juries. We know if a defendant is black or white. We know if a victim was the same race or different. We know the outcomes, conviction, acquittal, or a hung jury. But what we're not told is the actual racial makeup of the juries. We don't know how juries are chosen or the patterns of how these groups decide on guilt or innocence with respect to race and by what degree. The consulting industry operates in a fog. And when leaders like Clark ignore the data they do have, the fog becomes a disaster. So here's what the true crime wrong story is. The official story is that a jury let a guilty man walk because of race. The wrong story, the one that gets closer to the truth, is that a jury heard two competing narratives and one was more coherent than the other. Yes, race mattered, but not the way pundits said it did. Race mattered because it shaped which stories seemed plausible to jurors based on past experience. That's not jury failure. That's actually the jury system working. Jurors bringing in their full humanity, their full knowledge, their full experience to the table. But the real system failure, that was leadership. Marcia Clark had hard data. She had a consultant telling her exactly which jurors to avoid. She ignored him. She trusted her instincts about gender and empathy, and she built the jury the defense wanted. Then, under the glare of celebrity and live television, she misread her audience, staged a glove demonstration that backfired, and never gave those 12 people a coherent story they could safely believe in. A strong prosecutor can make jurors suspend their own priors, even when the defendant is famous, the cameras are relentless, and the facts are complicated. Clark wasn't that prosecutor. Cochran was that defense attorney, however. He listened. He disciplined his team. He told a single unified story about corruption and reasonable doubt. And the jury doing exactly what human brains are designed to do, chose the story that made sense. Clark failed to lead. She failed to read a jury. She failed to take advice. She failed to anticipate the weaknesses of those who climbed into the witness box. The Simpson trial didn't expose a flaw in jurors. It exposed a flaw in the experts who claim to understand them. And it exposed what happened when a leader confuses certainty with wisdom. I'm Alexandra Kitty. This has been True Crime Wrong Story. And next week, we're going to talk about two seemingly different episodes in legal history that have everything in common but one. So don't just watch the trial, watch the system.